Hey guys, Mrs. Kneifel's back, and I'm going to be continuing to read. If you're wondering what's up with my background, this is the quill on my bed. I'm sitting on the floor because my dog seems a little bit sad today. So I am chilling with my baby for a little bit. So I wanted to be on the floor so I was close to her. So I'm going to start with chapter 32, Chicken and Blackberry Kisses. It is page 205 in my book. All right. Gramps barreled through Wyoming like a house afire. We snaked through winding roads where the trees leaned close, rustling hush, rush, 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 rush. The road curved alongside rivers that rolled and gabbled, hurry, hurry, hurry. It was late when we arrived at Yellowstone. All we got to see that evening was a hot spring. We walked on the boardwalks pat placed across the bubbling mud. Huzzah, huzzah, Graham said, and we stayed at the Old Faithful Inn in a frontier cabin. I'd never seen Graham so excited. She could not wait for the next morning. We're going to see Old Faithful, she said over and over. It won't take too very long, will it? I said. And I felt like a mule saying it because Graham was so looking forward to it. Don't worry, Salamonica, Graham said. We'll just watch the old geyser blow, then we'll hit the road. I prayed all night long to the elm tree outside. I prayed that we would not get in an accident, that we would get to Lewiston, Idaho in time for my mother's birthday, and that we would bring her home. Later, I would realize that I had prayed for the wrong things. That night, Graham was so excited that she could not sleep. She rambled on about all sorts of things. She said to Gramps, "Remember that letter from the Eggman that you found under the mattress?" "Of course I remember. We had a wing ding of an argument over it. You told me you had no dang idea how it got there. You said the Eggman must have slipped into the bedroom and put it there. Well, I want you to know that I put it there." "I know that," Gramps said. "I'm not a complete noodle." "It's the only love letter anybody ever wrote me," Graham said. "You never wrote me any love letters. You never told me you wanted one." To me, Graham said, "Your grandfather nearly killed the Eggman over that letter." "Hell's bells," Grandpa said. "He wasn't worth killing." "Maybe not, but Gloria was." "Ah, yes," Graham said, placing his hand on his heart and pretending to swoon. "Gloria." "Cut that out," Graham said, rolling over on her side. "Tell me about PB. Tell me that story, but don't make it too awfully sad." She folded up her hands on her chest. "Tell me what happened with the lunatic." When I saw the picture of the lunatic on Sergeant Bickle's desk, I tore out of that office faster than lightning. I ran past Sergeant Bickle standing in the parking lot. No sign of Phoebe. I ran all the way to her house. As I passed Mrs. Cadaver's house, Mrs. Partridge called me up from her porch. "You're all dressed up," I said. "Going somewhere?" "Oh yes," she said. "I'm Reliable?" She tottered down the stairs, swinging her cobra cane in front of her. "Are you walking?" I asked. She reached down and touched her legs. "Isn't that what you call it when you move your legs like I'm doing?" "No, I meant, are you walking to wherever you're going?" "Oh no, that's much too far for these legs. Jimmy's coming. He'll be here in a minute." A car pulled up in front of the house. "There he is," she said. She called out to the driver, "I'm readable. I said I would be here, and I am here." The driver leaped out of the car. "Sal?" he said. "I had no idea you two were neighbors." It was Mr. Berkway. "We're not," I said. "It's Phoebe who's the neighbor." "Is that right?" he said, opening the car door for Mrs. Partridge. "Come on, Mom. Let's get a move on." "Mom?" I said. I looked at Mrs. Partridge. "This is your son?" "Why, of course," Mrs. Partridge said. "This is my little Jimmy." "But he's a Berkway." Mrs. Partridge said. "I was a Berkway once. Then I was a partridge. I'm still a partridge." "Then who is Mrs. Cadaver?" I said. "My little Margie," she said. "She was a Berkway too. Now she's a cadaver." I said to Mr. Berkway, "Mrs. Cadaver is your sister?" "We're twins," Mr. Berkway said. When they had driven away, I knocked at Phoebe's door, but there was no answer. At home, I dialed Phoebe's number over and over. No answer. The next day at school, I was relieved to see Phoebe. Where were you? I said. I have something to tell you. She turned away. I don't want to talk about it, she said. I do not wish to discuss it. I couldn't figure out what was the matter with her. It was a terrible day. We had tests in math and science. At lunch, Phoebe ignored me. Then came English. Mr. Berkway skipped into the room. People were gnawing on their fingers and tapping their feet and wiggling around and generally getting ulcers, wondering if Mr. Berkway was going to read from the journals. I stared at him. He and Margaret Cadaver were twins? Was that possible? The most disappointing part of this piece of knowledge was that he was not going to fall in love with Mrs. Cadaver and marry her and take her away. Mr. Berkway opened a cupboard, pulled out the journal, slipped the yellow paper over the corner of one, and read, this is what I like about Jane. She is smart, but she doesn't act like she knows everything. She is cute. She smells good. She's cute. She makes me laugh. She is cute. I got a prickly feeling up and down my arms. I wonder if Ben had written this about me. But then I realized that Ben didn't even know me when he wrote his journal. A little buzz was going around the room. Some people shifted in their seats. Chrissy was smiling, Megan was smiling, Beth Ann was smiling, Mary Lou was smiling. Every girl in the room was smiling. Each girl thought that this had been written about her. I looked carefully at each of the boys. Alex was gazing nonchalantly at Mr. Berkway. Then I saw Ben. He was sitting with his hands over his ears, staring down at his desk. The prickly feeling traveled all the way up my neck, then went skipping down my spine. He did write that, but he did not write it about me. Mr. Berkway exclaimed, Ah, love, ah, life. Sighing, he pulled out another journal and read, Jane doesn't know the first thing about boys. She once asked me what a kiss tastes like, so you could tell she hadn't ever kissed anyone. I told her they taste like chicken, and she believed me. She is so dumb sometimes. Mary Lou Finney jumped out of her chair. You cabbage head, she said to Beth Ann. You beef brain. Beth Ann wound a strand of hair around her finger. Mary Lou said, I did not believe you, and I do know what they taste like, and it isn't chicken. Ben drew a cartoon of two stick figures kissing. In the air over their head, the cartoon bubble was a chicken saying, Bawk, bawk, bawk. Mr. Berkway turned a few pages in the same journal and read, I hate doing this. I hate to write. I hate to read. I hate journals. I hate escaping English where teachers only talk about idiot symbols. I hate that idiot poem about the snowy woods, and I hate it when people say that woods symbolize death or beauty or sex or any other thing you want. I hate that. Maybe the woods are just woods. Beth Ann stood up. Mr. Berkway, she said, I do hate school. I do hate books. I do hate English. I do hate symbols. And I most definitely hate these idiot journals. There was a hush in the room. Mr. Berkway stared at Beth Ann for a minute, and in that minute, I was reminded of Mrs. Cadaver. For that brief time, his eyes looked just like hers. I was afraid he was going to strangle Beth Ann. But then he smiled, and his eyes became friendly, enormous cow eyes once again. I think he hypnotized her because Beth Ann sat down slowly. Mr. Berkway said, Beth Ann, I know exactly how you feel. Exactly. I love this passage. You do? She said. It's so honest. I had to admit, you couldn't get more honest than Beth Ann telling her English teacher that she hated symbols and English and idiot journals. Mr. Berkway said, I used to feel exactly like this. I could not understand what all the fuss was about symbols. He rummaged around at his desk. I want to show you something. He was pulling papers out and flinging them around. Finally, he held up a picture. Ah, here it is. Dynamite. What is this? He asked Ben. Ben said, It's a vase. Obviously. Mr. Berkway held the drawing in front of Beth Ann, who looked as if she might cry. Mr. Berkway said, Beth Ann, what do you see? A little tear dropped down her cheek. It's okay, Beth Ann. What do you see? I don't see an idiot vase, she said. I see two people. They're looking at each other. Right, Mr. Berkway said. Bravo. I'm right? Bravo. Ben said, Huh? Two people? I was thinking the same thing myself. What two people? Mr. Berkway said to Ben, And you were right, too. Bravo. He asked everyone else, How many see a vase? About half the class raised their hands. And how many see two faces? The rest of the class raised their hands. Then Mr. Berkway pointed out how you could see both. If you looked only at the white part in the center, you could clearly see the vase. If you looked only at the dark part on the sides, you could see two profiles. The curvy sides of the vase became the outline of the two heads facing each other. Mr. Berkway said that the drawing was a bit like symbols. Maybe the artist only interpreted to draw a vase. And maybe some people look at this picture and only see that vase. That is fine. But if some people look at it and see faces, what's wrong with that? It is faces to a person who is looking at it. And what is even more significant, you might see both. Beth Ann said, two for your money? Isn't it interesting, Mr. Berkway said, to find both? Isn't it interesting to discover that snowy woods could be death and beauty and even, I suppose, sex? Wow, literature. Did he say sex? Ben said, copying the drawing. I thought Mr. Berkway was finished with the journals for the day, but he made a great show of closing his eyes and pulling something from near the bottom of the stack. She popped the blackberries into her mouth. Then she looked all around. It was mine. I could hardly bear it. She took 2 steps up to the maple tree and threw her arms around it and kissed it. People were giggling. I thought I could detect a small dark stain, as from a blackberry kiss. Ben looked at me from across the room. After Mr. Berkway read about my mother's blackberry kiss, he read about how I kissed the tree and how I have kissed all different kinds of trees since then, and how each tree has a special taste, all its own. And mixed in with that taste is the taste of blackberries. By now, because both Ben and Phoebe were staring at me, everyone else stared too. She kisses trees, Megan said. I might have died right then and there if Mr. Berkway had not immediately picked up another journal. He stabbed his finger in the middle of the page and read, I'm very concerned about Mrs. Mr. Berkway stared down at the page. It looked as if he couldn't read the handwriting. He started again. I'm very concerned about Mrs. Corpse. Her suspicious behavior suggests that she murdered her own husband. Phoebe's eyes blinked rapidly. Go on, Ben said. Finish. You could tell that Mr. Berkway was regretting that he had ever started this business with the journals. But all around the room, people were shouting, Yes, finish. So he reluctantly continued. I believe she had buried, excuse me. I believe she has buried him in her backyard. When the bell rang, people went berserk. Wow, a murder? Who wrote that? And is it real? I was out of the room faster than anything chasing after Phoebe. Megan called out after me, You kiss trees! I tore out of the building. No Phoebe. Idiot journals, I thought. Gall dong idiot journals. Oh my goodness, I cannot believe. So Miss Corpse is actually Mrs. Cadaver. And remember, Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway are twins. So he just read about how Phoebe thinks his twin is a murderer. Oh my goodness, so good. I'm going to continue on with chapter 33, everyone. The Visitor. Graham and Gramps were both still awake in our frontier cabin on the edge of Yellowstone National Park. Aren't you sleepy yet? I said. Gramps said, I don't know what's the matter with me. I don't feel like going to sleep at all. I want to know what happened to Peavy. I'll tell you about Mr. Berkway's visit. Then I'll stop for tonight. I went over to Phoebe's after dinner on the day Mr. Berkway had read from my journal about blackberry kisses and from Phoebe's about Mrs. Cadaver. In Phoebe's bedroom, I said, I've got 2 important things to tell you. The doorbell rang, and we heard a familiar tone. That sounds like Mr. Berkway, Phoebe said. That's one of the things I want to tell you, I said, about Mr. Berkway. There was a tap on Phoebe's door. Her father said, Phoebe, can you and Sal come downstairs with me? I thought Mr. Berkway was going to be mad at Phoebe for what she had written about his sister. The worst thing was Phoebe didn't even know yet that Mrs. Cadaver was Mr. Berkway's sister. I felt like we were lambs being led to the slaughter. Take us, I thought. Take us and do away with us quickly. We followed Phoebe's father downstairs. There, on the sofa, was Mr. Berkway, holding Phoebe's journal and looking embarrassed. That is my own private journal, Phoebe said, with my own private thoughts. I know, Mr. Berkway said, and I want to apologize for reading it out loud. Apologize? That was a relief. It was so quiet in the room that I could hear the leaves being blown off the trees outside. Mr. Berkway coughed. I want to explain something, he said. Mrs. Cadaver is my sister. Your sister? Phoebe said. And her husband is dead. I thought so, Phoebe said, but she didn't murder him, Mr. Berkway said. Her husband died when a drunk driver rammed into his car. My mother, Mrs. Partridge, was also in the car with Mrs. Cadaver. She didn't die, as you know, but she lost her sight. Oh, I said. Phoebe stared at the floor. My sister Margaret was the nurse on duty in the emergency room when they brought in her husband and our mother. Margaret's husband died that night. The whole time Mr. Berkway was talking, Phoebe's father was sitting beside her with his hand resting on her shoulder. It looked like the only thing that was keeping Phoebe from being vaporized into the air and disappearing was his hand resting there. I just wanted you to know, Mr. Berkway said, that Mr. Cadaver is not buried in her backyard. I've also learned about your mother, Phoebe, and I'm sorry that she's gone, but I assure you that Margaret would not have kidnapped or murdered her. After Mr. Berkway left, Phoebe and I sat on the front porch. Phoebe said, if Mrs. Cadaver didn't kidnap her and murder my mother, then where is she? What can I do? Where should I look? Phoebe, I said, there's something I've got to tell you. Look, Sal, if you're going to tell me that she's not coming back, I don't want to hear it. You might as well go home now. I know who the lunatic is. It's Sergeant Bickle's son. And so, we devised a plan. At home that night, all I could think about was Mrs. Cadaver. I could see her in her white uniform working in the emergency room. I could see an ambulance pulling up with its blue lights flashing and her walking briskly to the swinging doors with her wild hair all around her face. I could see the stretchers being wheeled in, and I could see Mrs. Cadaver looking down at them. I could see her heart thumping like mad as she realized it was her own husband and her own mother lying there. I imagined Mrs. Cadaver touching her husband's face. It was as if I was walking in her moccasins. That's how much my own heart was pumping and my own hands were sweating. I started wondering if the birds of sadness had built their nest in Mrs. Cadaver's hair afterwards, and if so, how she got rid of them. Her husband dying and her mother being blind were events that would matter in a course of a lifetime. I saw everyone else going on with their own agendas while Mrs. Cadaver was frantically trying to keep her husband and her mother alive. Did she regret anything? Did she know the worth of water before the well was dry? All those messages had invaded my brain and affected the way I looked at things. Are you sleepy yet, Graham? I asked. My voice was hoarse from talking so much. No, Chickabiddy, but you go to sleep. I'm just gonna lie here a while and think about things. She nudged Gramps. You forgot to say about the marriage bed. Gramps yawned. Sorry, Gooseberry. He patted the bed and said it. Oh, my goodness. So now we officially know what happened to Mr. Cadaver. Man, that was an intense chapter. All right, we're going to read chapter 34 in this video. Maybe we'll go on to chapter 35. Maybe I'll just read forever. Probably not, though. This video's getting a little bit long. So let's just do 34, and then I'll stop. Old Faithful, and that is page 222 in my book. The next day was probably one of the best and surely the worst in Graham and Graham's lives. Okay, right there. Best and worst. Oh, my goodness. What's going to happen? The whispers woke me up early. It was the 6th day, and the next day was my mother's birthday. We had to get out of Wyoming and through Montana. Gramps was already up, but Graham was lying on the bed staring at the ceiling. Did you ever go to sleep? I asked. No, she said. I didn't feel like sleeping. I can sleep later. She climbed out of bed. Let's go see that Old Faithful. I've waited my whole entire life to see Old Faithful. You sure got your heart set on that, don't you, you stubborn gooseberry, said Gramps. I sure do, Gramps said. We parked the car and walked up a low hill. I was afraid Graham was going to be disappointed because it didn't look like much at first. There was a rope fence around a mound on the side of the hill. The ground was scrabbly dirt, and in the center of the rope, enclosed about 20 feet away, was a hole. Heck, Graham said. Can't we get any closer than that? Gramps and I walked over to read the sign about Old Faithful. A park ranger rushed past us yelling, Ma'am! God dang, Gramps said. Graham was crawling under the rope. The ranger stopped her. Ma'am, there's a reason for that rope, he said. Gramps brushed off her dress. I just wanted to see better. Don't worry, the ranger said. You'll get a good look. Please stay behind the rope. The sign that Old Faithful was due to erupt in 15 minutes. More and more people gathered around the rope. There were people of all ages, little babies crying, grannies sitting on folding stools, teenagers plugged into radio headsets, couples smooching. There were people speaking languages other than English. Next to us was a tour group of Italians. Across the way was a group of Germans. Grandma tapped her fingers together, getting more and more excited. Is it time? She kept saying. Is it almost time? The crowd became quiet a few minutes before Old Faithful was due to go off. Everyone stared at the hole. Everyone was listening. Is it time? Graham said. There was a faint noise and a little spit spout out of the hole. The man next to us said, "Aw, is that all?" Another voice, this time a little louder, gathering in crutching sound like walking on gravel. Two fitful spits. "Aw," the man said. Then it was like the radiator boiling over or a tea kettle blowing its top. Old Faithful hissed and steamed, and a sudden spout of water shot out, maybe 3 feet high. "Aw," the man said, "is that it?" More steam, boiling and hissing, and a huge jing bang spray of water surged out, climbing and climbing, and then more and more until it looked like a whole river of water shooting straight up into the air. "It looks like an upside down waterfall," Graham said. All the while there were walloping hissings, and I could have sworn the ground rumbled and trembled underneath us. The warm mist blew towards us, and people started backing away, all except Graham. She stood there grinning, tilting her face up to the mist and staring at the fountain water. "Oh," she said, "oh, huzzah, huzzah." She shouted it into the air and noise. Gramps wasn't watching Old Faithful. He was watching Graham. He put his arm around her and hugged her. "You like this old geezer, don't you?" he said. "Oh," Graham said. "Oh, yes, I do." The man next to us was staring open-mouthed at Old Faithful. "Lordy," he said. "Lordy, that's amazing." Gradually, Old Faithful slowed down. We watched it undo itself and retreat into its hole. We stood there even after everyone else had drifted away. At last, Graham sighed and said, "Okay, let's go." We were inside the car and about to leave when Graham started to cry. "God dang," Graham said. "What's the matter?" Graham sniffled. "Oh, nothing. I'm so happy I got to see Old Faithful." "You old gooseberry," Graham said. And on we went. "We were gonna eat up Montana," Gramps said. "We're gonna get to Idaho border tonight. You watch me. I'm putting this pedal to the metal." He stepped on the gas and peeled out of the parking lot. "Idaho, here we come!" Yay. All right, I'm going to stop there. So that was chapters 32, 33, and 34. Next video, I will be reading some more. Happy reading.